You watched a whole film in English last night and followed almost all of it. This morning someone asked you a simple question, and you produced 4 words and a shrug. Same language, same person, 12 hours apart. And you have quietly concluded from this that your speaking is bad, or that you are shy, or that you need more practice. None of those is the real answer, and the real answer is much more useful, because it tells you exactly what to do. Start with something that sounds obvious and is not. Understanding and speaking are not 2 levels of the same skill. They are 2 different operations, and they use your English in opposite directions. When you listen, the English arrives. You do not have to produce anything. Context does half the work, the speaker's face does some more, and if you miss a word entirely, the sentence around it usually saves you. When you speak, none of that exists. There is no context to lean on, because you are the one creating the context. Nothing arrives. Everything has to be pulled out. So the question is not why your speaking is worse than your listening. Of course it is worse. The question is why the gap is so much bigger than you expect. Here is the first piece. You have 2 vocabularies, not 1. Researchers separate what they call receptive vocabulary, the words you recognize when you meet them, from productive vocabulary, the words you can actually produce when you need them. Paul Nation, who has spent a career measuring this, describes them as related but genuinely separate, and the gap between them is not small. Study after study finds learners recognizing far more than they can produce, sometimes only half of what they know coming out on demand. Think about what that means. Every time you have counted your vocabulary, you counted the wrong one. You counted the words you can recognize, and then you were surprised when a different, smaller set showed up in the conversation. And notice how invisible that is from the inside. When you read a word and understand it instantly, your brain files that as knowing the word. It feels identical to knowing. There is no signal, no warning, nothing that tells you this particular word will not be there when you reach for it later. So your sense of your own English is built almost entirely out of moments where the word was handed to you, which means the number in your head has never once been tested in the direction you actually need. Now here is the part that makes the gap grow instead of shrink. Recognition and production are trained by completely different activities, and almost everything you do trains recognition. Watching a series trains recognition. Reading trains recognition. Flashcards that show you an English word and ask what it means train recognition. Subtitles train recognition. You have spent years doing exercises that make the receptive side larger, and then wondered why the productive side did not move with it. It was never going to move. Nothing you were doing pointed at it. And this is worth sitting with, because it explains a very specific frustration. You are not imagining the fact that you have improved. Your listening genuinely is better than it was 2 years ago. Your reading is better. You understand jokes you would have missed before. All of that is real progress on one side of a wall, and none of it crosses over on its own. 2 learners with identical study hours can end up in completely different places purely because of which direction those hours pointed. There is a second piece, and it explains why the gap feels so much worse in real conversation than it does when you practice alone. Speed. Norman Segelovitz studies automaticity in second languages, and the important point is not just how fast you can retrieve something, it is how consistently. You may know a word perfectly and still need 2 seconds to reach it. On any test you would score that as known. In a conversation, 2 seconds is a hole. And when a hole appears, you do not calmly wait. You panic slightly, and you reach for something easier. So the words you produce are not your best words. They are your fastest words. That is why recordings of yourself always sound simpler than you feel inside. You are not hearing your English. You are hearing the small subset of it that arrives inside 1 second. And that subset gets reinforced every time you use it. The fast words get faster. The slow words, the interesting ones, the precise ones, sit unused and get slower. Left alone, this problem does not stay the same size. It grows. And there is a third piece that most people never consider because it does not feel like language at all. When you speak, you are doing several jobs at once, choosing the idea, finding the words, building the grammar, monitoring whether it sounds right, listening to the other person, managing how you feel about all of it. When you listen, you do one job. Alan Badley's work on working memory is the reason this matters so much. The space those jobs run in is small, and it is shared. 4 processes competing for it is not a small inconvenience. It is the difference between a sentence arriving whole and a sentence collapsing halfway through. And the moment one of those processes takes too long, the others start dropping things. That is what it feels like when you lose the end of your own sentence and cannot remember where you were going. So speaking is not the same skill under harder conditions. It is a genuinely different task with 4 extra processes running underneath it, and every one of them is competing for the same limited attention. Which brings us to the twist, and it is the reason most advice about this fails. More speaking practice is not the fix. I know that sounds wrong, but think about what happens when you practice speaking without changing anything else. You use your fastest words, avoid the structures you find difficult, and get more fluent at the version of English you already had. You are not building the productive side. You are polishing the small part of it that already works, while the rest stays exactly where it was. That is why people who talk to foreigners every day for years still speak in the same 300 words. Not because they lack practice, because practice alone only rehearses what already arrives quickly. Meryl Swain's argument about output is worth being precise about here, because it is often quoted badly. Her point was not that speaking makes you fluent by repetition. It was that producing language forces you to notice the gap between what you wanted to say and what you can actually say. That noticing is the valuable part. Which means speaking practice only helps you if you are paying attention to what failed. Speaking on autopilot comfortably in your fastest 300 words produces no noticing at all, and therefore produces nothing. So what actually moves it? The fix is to attack the conversion directly. Take things from the recognition side and force them across into production. 4 ways, and they are smaller than you expect. First, reverse every flashcard you own. If your card shows English and asks for the meaning, it is training recognition. Turn it around. Show yourself the meaning, the picture, the situation, and force yourself to produce the English out loud before you check. That single change turns a recognition exercise into a production exercise, and it costs you nothing but the direction of the card. And notice that all 4 of these are the same move. Take something that currently only exists on the recognition side and force it, deliberately, out of your mouth. That is the entire method. Everything else is detail. Second, steal, do not invent. The next time you watch something and think that was a nice way to say it, stop the video. Say the phrase out loud 3 times. Then make one new sentence with it about your own life out loud immediately. Most people notice good phrasing constantly and never move a single one of those phrases across. They stay on the recognition side forever, admired and never used. Third, speak before you are ready. Take 1 minute a day and talk out loud with nobody listening. About your day, about what you just read, about anything. The value is not the fluency, it is the discovery. You will hit a wall about 8 seconds in, and that wall is a specific missing thing you now know about. That is the most useful information you will get all day, and you can only get it by producing. Fourth, prepare, then produce, then compare. Say a sentence out loud, then find out how someone would actually say it. Notice the difference. That gap is your entire lesson, and it took 20 seconds. This is also the step nobody does because it requires being wrong on purpose. You have to produce the imperfect version first, before you are allowed to see the good one. If you look first, you are back on the recognition side, and you have learned nothing. Now, one thing to be honest about. Your receptive vocabulary is not wasted. It is the raw material. Every word sitting on that side is a word you could convert, and converting a word you already recognize is far faster than learning one from nothing. You are not starting from zero. You are sitting on a warehouse, and you have simply never had a door between the warehouse and the shop. Everything I described is a door. So think about last night again. You followed an entire film. That was not luck, and it was not the subtitles. That was a real, large, working English vocabulary doing exactly what it was trained to do. This morning you produced 4 words, not because your English is small, but because almost nothing you have ever done asked your English to come out. Your speaking is not behind your listening because you are bad at speaking. It is behind because you have been training one direction for years and expecting the other one to follow. So today, do not practice more. Take 5 words you understood perfectly this week and force each one out of your mouth in a sentence about your own life. That is 5 words converted. Do that daily and the gap closes from the only side it was ever going to close from.